For most of modern history, money has been a domestic story. You earn it, you spend it, and it mostly stays within the borders of your country. But the US dollar is something different. It is not just America's currency. It is the unit that prices oil, settles global trade, backs central bank reserves, and anchors balance sheets from São Paulo to Seoul. The dollar is the language that the entire financial system speaks, a language that even people who resent American power are forced to use. So how did one country's currency become the world's operating system, and what happens when that operating system starts to creak under its own weight? This is the story of how the dollar rose from post-war convenience to uncontested monetary empire, and how that very success has pushed it into a position that looks less like safe forever and more like too powerful to fail. To understand the dollar's role today, we have to start in a world where it was not inevitable. In the early 20th century, global finance ran on the British pound. London was the clearinghouse for world trade. Bills of exchange were written in sterling. If you were a merchant in Argentina or India, you did business in the currency of an empire whose navy guarded the sea lanes. But 2 world wars changed that. Britain won on the battlefield and lost on the balance sheet. By the mid-20th century, the United States had become the industrial and financial heavyweight. Its factories were intact. Its gold reserves were unmatched. Its economy was large, growing, and relatively untouched by the bombed-out devastation in Europe and Asia. In 1944, with World War II still raging, representatives from 44 countries met in a small town in New Hampshire, Bretton Woods. Their goal was to design a more stable international monetary system, one that would avoid the chaos of the interwar years. The competitive devaluations, sudden stops, and currency wars that had helped feed extremism and conflict. The solution they settled on was a kind of hybrid. Currencies would be pegged to the dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate, $35 per ounce. In theory, any central bank could show up at the US Treasury and trade its dollars for gold at that price. In practice, the new system did something more important than relinking money to metal. It quietly made the US dollar the anchor for almost everything. If you wanted stability, you pegged to the dollar. If you wanted to borrow, you borrowed in dollars. If you wanted to hold reserves, you held dollars. Gold was still in the story, but the real gravity now came from the scale of the American economy, and from the fact that the US emerged from the war not as one creditor among many, but as the central supplier of goods, capital, and security. For a while, this arrangement seemed almost frictionless. Europe and Japan rebuilt under the umbrella of American power. Global trade recovered. The dollar was as good as gold and in some ways more convenient. But there was a problem baked into the design. To provide the world with enough dollars to grow, the United States had to send its currency abroad through trade deficits, investment, and military spending. The more the world relied on dollars, the more the US had to supply them, which meant running balance of payments deficits for others to hold as assets. This created a paradox. To act as the world's monetary anchor, America had to behave less like a thrifty banker and more like a patient whose blood was continuously being drawn to keep others alive. In the 1960s, this tension became harder to ignore. US spending on the Vietnam War and on domestic programs rose. Dollars flowed out of the country. Foreign central banks accumulated more and more claims on the US, more and more pieces of paper that, on paper, could be turned into gold at $35 an ounce. On the surface, the system still looked stable. Underneath, something else was happening. The stock of dollars held abroad was growing much faster than the gold base that was supposed to back them. Foreign governments could do the math. Some began quietly exchanging their dollars for gold, shrinking US reserves and testing the promise at the heart of Bretton Woods. By the early 1970s, it was clear that the numbers did not add up. The United States could either defend the old gold price and accept brutal domestic adjustment, higher interest rates, lower spending, and a much smaller global role, or it could break the link. In 1971, President Richard Nixon chose the latter. He closed the gold window. From that point on, foreign central banks could no longer swap their dollars for US gold at a fixed price. Technically, this ended the Bretton Woods system, but it did not end the dollar's rise. In some ways, it intensified it. Freed from gold, the dollar became a pure fiat currency, but also the centerpiece of a new, more flexible, and more dangerous architecture. In the 1970s, oil prices spiked. The United States struck a deal with key producers in the Middle East, price oil in dollars, recycle surplus petrodollars back into US and Western financial markets, and receive in exchange a mix of security guarantees, weapons, and access. The result was the petrodollar system. Energy, the lifeblood of industrial economies, was now tied even more tightly to the US currency. If you were a country that needed oil, you needed dollars. If you ran a trade deficit and wanted to borrow on international markets, you borrowed in dollars. If you were a central bank that wanted safety and liquidity, you held US Treasury bonds, IOUs, issued by a government that could always print the currency in which those IOUs were denominated. Over time, the dollar's role changed from currency used for trade to something more like operating system of global finance. Banks and corporations around the world did not just use dollars for transactions, they built their balance sheets on dollar debt. This created a hidden empire. The United States could now exert power not only through armies and alliances, but through the plumbing of the financial system, sanctions, access to payment networks, the ability to cut off institutions from dollar clearing. These became tools of influence, sometimes deployed quietly, sometimes very publicly. But each layer of convenience and power came with a layer of risk. The more the world borrowed in dollars, the more vulnerable it became to conditions set in Washington. When the US Federal Reserve lowered interest rates, credit flowed easily to emerging markets. Dollars seemed plentiful, and growth surged. When the Fed raised rates to fight inflation at home, to stabilize its own financial system, those same borrowers could suddenly find themselves in crisis. Their local currency fell against the dollar. Servicing dollar debts became more expensive. Capital flowed out just when they needed it most. From Latin American crises in the 1980s to the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s to repeated debt scares in the 21st century, the pattern has reappeared. A global system built around one country's currency exports both stability and instability. It offers a ready-made unit of account, a deep pool of safe assets, and a liquid market. But it also ties the fate of dozens of countries to the domestic monetary cycle of a single central bank. As long as things are calm, this hidden hierarchy can be easy to ignore. In stress, it becomes brutally obvious. When there is a dash for cash, cash means dollars. The global financial crisis of 2008 made that clear. The epicenter was in the United States, a housing and banking bubble fueled by leverage and complexity. But when the crunch came, it was not just American institutions that were starved of dollars. European banks, Asian firms, and emerging market borrowers all found that their dependence on dollar funding meant their problems could not be solved domestically. Central banks and the Federal Reserve responded with swap lines, emergency lending, and a flood of new dollars. A decade later, during the COVID-19 shock, the pattern repeated. A sudden scramble for dollar liquidity, followed by a giant intervention from the same central bank that runs policy for the US economy. The dollar system has learned how to rescue itself, for now. But these rescues come at a cost. Each crisis reinforces the idea that there is no real alternative to the dollar. Each wave of intervention embeds the dollar even more deeply in the core of the system. And each expansion of the dollar's reach creates new layers of dependency and leverage that will matter in the next crisis. This is the paradox of a currency empire. The more indispensable it becomes, the more intolerable the consequences of its failure, and the more its managers feel compelled to stretch their tools to keep it functioning. Meanwhile, the domestic reality inside the United States does not always match the external image of endless strength. The privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency has made it easier to run large deficits, to consume more than the country produces, and to rely on foreign demand for US assets to keep interest rates lower than they might otherwise be. For decades, this has felt like a free lunch, but it is, in its own way, another version of the pattern we have seen in past empires. External demand for your currency and debt allows you to delay hard choices, to turn future obligations into present comfort. Over time, you build a structure in which the rest of the world depends on your liabilities as their assets, and you depend on their dependence to sustain your own financial architecture. The dollar's dominance has also pushed other countries to search for partial workarounds. Regional currency arrangements, bilateral swap lines, experiments in trading commodities in non-dollar units. So far, none of these has displaced the dollar. But they do highlight a tension. A system that concentrates this much power and risk in one node invites both political resistance and quiet diversification. When you zoom out, the dollar's story looks less like a straight line up and more like a curve. First, a rise built on real productive strength and the aftermath of war. Then, a formal system, Bretton Woods, that anchored currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold. Then, a break with gold that did not end the dollar's role, but transformed it into the backbone of a much more financialized world. Then, waves of crises that revealed both how central the dollar had become and how fragile dollar-based balance sheets could be. Today we live in the late phase of that curve. The dollar is still the unit for global trade. US Treasuries are still the default safe asset. The Federal Reserve is still in practice the central bank of both America and the shadows of everyone who borrows in its currency. There is no ready replacement waiting in the wings, but that does not mean the system is permanent. Past empires did not fall the moment someone drew a better blueprint. They faltered when the costs of maintaining the old order outpaced their capacity to bear them, when the benefits of centralization and control were outweighed by the fragility they created. In Spain's case, silver fueled both grandeur and bankruptcy. In Britain's case, the pound's prestige delayed necessary adjustment until the bill came due after 2 world wars. In the Soviet case, control over production and information created blind spots that turned rigidity into collapse. The dollar's empire is different in many ways. It is not backed by territorial conquest in the old sense, nor by a single ideology about planning. It is backed by networks, contracts, and habits, by the inertia of institutions that find it easier to keep using what everyone else is already using. But the pattern is still recognizable. Early advantage turns into structural dependence. Tools created for stability become tools of power. Short-term fixes to crises entrench long-term vulnerabilities. This is not a prediction that the dollar will vanish next year, or that some rival currency will suddenly take its place. It is a reminder that monetary empires, like political ones, are made of human decisions, balance sheets and trade-offs. They can be stretched, they can be patched, they can be managed, but they are not immune to the basic logic that governs every system we have looked at. If you build an order on ever-growing claims that must never be allowed to fail, you are not eliminating collapse, you are concentrating its possibility. On this channel, we are not cheering for that outcome. We are trying to map it, from Spain's silver to Britain's pound, to the Soviet command economy, to today's dollar-based finance, we are tracing the same underlying questions. How much strain can one center bear? How many promises can be piled onto a single unit of account? And what happens when the world's safest asset sits at the heart of a system that keeps producing its own crises? If you want to see how the dollar's story fits into the larger pattern and what other structures might be approaching their own stress points, subscribe to Collapse Pattern. Don't just watch history happen, see it coming.